Welcome back. In the previous video we covered part 1 of the NAP Handbook, Basic Information. In this one we'll be covering part 2, Available Coverage. In the first video we learned that NAP provides assistance to producers by helping them to recoup some of the expenses that are lost after a disaster. Now we'll take a closer look at the coverage options available to producers. We'll begin at paragraph 50. Before we go too far, it's helpful to learn some of the terms you'll hear in this section. When we refer to basic 50-55 coverage, we'll sometimes use the phrase CAT or catastrophic coverage interchangeably. When you hear these phrases, they all mean the lowest level of coverage offered. In addition to basic coverage, producers can also elect buy-up coverage. When you hear buy-up, you should think about your car insurance. If you want to lower your deductible, meaning that the insurance company pays a larger portion of your vehicle repair, you pay a larger premium. With NAP, buy-up coverage essentially lowers the producer's deductible on a given crop. Once again, we see here that there's some bold text, which tells us that the text is coming directly from federal regulations. Paragraph 50b gives us a good explanation of what basic coverage offers. When a producer plants a crop which is later affected by a disaster event, we consider that as being a loss of yield or production. Under basic coverage, the deductible is 50% of the expected crop, meaning we'll calculate a payment when the amount of crop loss exceeds 50% of what the crop was expected to produce. For example, if a producer suffered a 60% crop loss, we would compensate them for the difference between their deductible and the actual crop loss. In this case, we'd issue a payment on 10% of the lost crop. Once we calculate the amount of production eligible for payment, the payment itself would be calculated using 55% of the average market price for that crop. For those of you doing the math, already you realize that the producer losing 100% of their crop, the most we would compensate them would be 55% of half their expected production, or essentially 28% of the total crop's expected revenue. As we said in the first training, NAP does not guarantee revenue. It is meant to help producers recoup the expense of growing the crop. There are also times when a disaster event might prevent a farmer from planting the crop in the first place. We call this prevented planting. In prevented planting claims, the deductible is 35% of the total planned acreage. For producers who want to shift more of the liability for crop losses off of themselves, buy-up coverage offers a number of different coverage levels, all of which are paid at 100% of the average market price. Buy-up coverage is offered to reduce producers' deductibles from 50% to as little as 35% through increments of 5%. In other words, a producer can purchase coverage in buy-up for 50, 55, 60, or 65% of their crop's expected production and at 100% of the average market price. Producers can select varying levels of coverage for their crops. The only limitation is that crops that fall into the same pay crop and pay type must have the same coverage level selected. In this example, we see that the producer selected basic coverage for figs, highlighted in blue, and buy-up for the figs highlighted in red. In this case, we're looking at a single crop, figs, but because there are two different pay types for the figs, pay type 1 and 2, the producer was able to select different coverage levels, basic and buy-up. Now that we've seen coverage levels available to a producer, let's take a look at the cause of loss covered by the NAP program. Once again, when you see bold text, know that it is coming directly from federal regulations. In this case, all of the bold text is covered and clarified in paragraph 51b. In order for a cause of loss to be eligible, the event had to have been completely beyond the control of any one person. In other words, natural disasters, damaging weather, and related conditions are eligible causes of loss because no one can control the weather. The paragraph lists a few examples for each category. Insufficient chill hours is another eligible cause of loss, though this type of loss does not currently apply to New York, so we're going to skip it. Excess moisture and precipitation is often cited as a cause of loss. In 2017, this paragraph was modified to give further clarification as to how claims of excess moisture should be evaluated by COCs. The intent of the change was to ensure that damage related to excess moisture was being thoroughly examined. Unlike hail damage or outright flooding, the effects of excess moisture might not be as clear or straightforward. COCs therefore need to consider each claim of excess moisture on a case-by-case basis. It is important to note that approval of excess moisture claims cannot be delegated to the CED, unlike other causes of loss. So if eligible causes of loss are beyond anyone's control, you can probably guess what constitutes an ineligible cause of loss. Things like poor weed management or failure to follow good farming practices do not constitute an eligible cause of loss. Here are a few of the more common ineligible causes of loss. Factors or circumstances that are not the direct result of an eligible cause of loss. Failure of a producer to follow good farming practices. Neglect or malfeasance of a producer. Quarantine that is imposed by county, state, or federal government. Drifting herbicide. Prevented planting caused by chemical or herbicide residue. Wildlife damages. Inability of a producer to obtain a market for the crop. Inability of the crop to mature in time to meet a specific market. For crops using organic farming practices, failure to comply with organic standards, and weeds. We've been talking about crops for a while now, but we haven't actually covered what defines an eligible crop. For the purposes of this program, eligible crops mean commercial agriculture crops, commodities or acreage of commodities grown for food or fiber, and commercial or industrial crops for which crop insurance, excluding pilot coverage or insurance, is not available. In some cases, a particular crop might only be available in your county under a pilot program or through a written agreement with the insurance company. In these cases, a producer could have both NAP coverage and coverage under the pilot program. However, they cannot double dip, meaning that they cannot be paid for the same loss under both policies. We'll cover this more later when we discuss multiple benefit exclusion. This next bit has a lot of jargon packed into it. P and CP means planted and considered planted acreage. It's saying that the loss can only be paid for the initially planted crop on given acreage. The exception here is if the county is approved for certain double cropping scenarios. We'll also cover double cropping later, but for now, the important concept to understand is this. If a producer plants a crop, say pumpkins, which is destroyed by a flooding event in July, we will not cover a second crop planted on that same acreage. Below is a list of the crops considered eligible for NAP assistance. They include aquaculture, biomass crops, or crops grown for green energy. Christmas trees, crops grown for fiber, crops grown for food. Crops planted and grown for livestock consumption. Floriculture crops, ginseng, industrial crops, honey, maple sap, mushrooms, ornamental nursery, sea oats and seagrass, seed crops, turf grass sod. There are also some crops which are considered ineligible for NAP coverage. As this is the non-insurable crop disaster assistance program, you might have guessed that insured crops would be at the top of the list. Additionally, byproducts of crops are ineligible. An example might be corn stalks sold as decorations after the corn has been harvested. Crops that are grown without good farming practices being applied is a little tricky to pin down, as there isn't a clear definition or guidance here. This line, I believe, is made intentionally vague so as to protect the program's integrity from all kinds of abuse. Non-ornamental nursery plants could include fruit trees grown for private homeowners to plant in their backyard. However, a nursery growing propagation stock for a commercial operation could get coverage. Home gardens, experimental crops, and volunteer stands are out as well. Livestock is not covered by NAP, but keep in mind that does not apply to aquaculture, which can be insured through NAP. First-year seedings of biennial and perennial forage are not eligible because they are not expected to yield a normal crop in their first year of establishment. Likewise, immature orchards are not expected to yield full crops either. For guidance on what is considered immature, take a look at the One NAP New York amendments. Crops which the State Committee has determined cannot be practically or viably grown commercially in the state are out. An example here could be pineapple being grown in New York. We see again replacement crop acreage, which we'll cover more when we get to the double cropped acreage. The practice exception applies to crops that are insurable in a county as either irrigated or non-irrigated, but not both. If RMA required that soybeans grown in the county were irrigated in order to cover them, we could then offer coverage to growers of non-irrigated soybeans. However, you'd want to make sure that good farming practices are being applied. If you're looking to apply this exception, you'll need to send the request to DAFP along with supporting documentation. The definition of coverage period is an important one that you'll probably reference quite a bit, so I'd recommend noting where to find it. The coverage period cannot begin sooner than 30 days after the application for coverage is made. This prevents a producer from holding off on buying coverage until a big storm is in the forecast and then running out to buy coverage just before it hits. Coverage for a crop begins only after the crop is actually planted. That means if a producer purchased coverage for lettuce on January 1st, coverage could begin on the 31st, but only if the crop was actually planted at that time. If the producer waited until March 30th to begin planting, then March 30th would be the beginning of the coverage period for the producer's lettuce. Coverage periods vary slightly between annuals, perennials, multiple planting crops, value loss crops, etc. For annual crops, though, it begins the later of either the following, 30 days after the date the 471 is actually filed, or the date the crop is planted, not to exceed the final planting date. And it ends the earlier of any of the following. The harvest date is the date harvest is completed, the final harvest date as determined by the state committee, abandonment of the crop, or total destruction of the crop. For multiple planted crops, that means crops that have multiple planting periods and are planted in succession, then the only big distinction is that the coverage period begins the date the crop is planted within that specific planting period. For perennial crops other than perennial crops intended for forage, coverage begins the later of the following: 30 days after the application closing date, or 30 days after the 471 is actually filed. And it ends the earlier of the following: 10 months from the application closing date, or the date harvest is complete, final harvest date, abandonment of the crop, total destruction of the crop. Value loss crops, again, are going to be treated a little bit differently. We haven't really covered value loss crops yet, but the short definition is a crop which does not lend itself easily to yield measurements in terms of production would be considered a value loss crop. Crops like Christmas trees or oysters, where it's either a good viable plant or mollusk, or it's not. In those cases, the crop is considered inventory or a value loss crop. These crops have different coverage periods. They begin the later of the following: June 1st for ornamental nursery, October 1st for value loss crops other than ornamental nursery, or 30 days after the date the 471 is actually filed. Coverage for value loss crops ends the earlier of the following: May 31st for ornamental nursery, or September 30th for value loss crops other than ornamental nursery. And again, the date the crop, inventory, or product for which coverage was obtained is disposed of or destroyed, or the date the crop is abandoned. For honey, coverage begins January 1st or 30 days after the 471 is purchased, and it ends December 31st. For maple sap, coverage begins the date the trees come out of dormancy, because obviously you're not planting a maple tree that you're tapping that same season. So the date the trees come out of dormancy, coverage begins. Coverage ends the date the maple tree sap harvest is complete. For biennial and perennial forage crops, coverage begins the date following the final harvest date of the previous crop year. Forage stands that have aged that no longer represent a majority of the intended crop seeded will have coverage offered as either mixed forage or native grass. So that's important when you're taking down the acreage report, that you are going over the planting with the producer to make sure that that definition has not changed over the years of continuous coverage. We now know which crops can be covered and which are ineligible. as well as the various coverage levels. The next consideration for coverage is the amount of assistance. You'll remember that basic coverage applies to 50% of the expected production and 55% of the average market price. The term payment rate is used to describe that 55% factor. As you see in this paragraph, basic coverage has a payment rate of 55%, while all other levels of buy-up coverage have a 100% payment rate. The last term in this paragraph, payment factors, applies to 3 stages of production: prevented planting, unharvested, and harvested. The harvested factor is always 100%. The unharvested factor is always less than the harvested factor, and the prevented planting payment factor is always less than unharvested. The difference in these factors are meant to reflect the differences incurred in expenses. If a crop was prevented from being planted, the producer might only pay for seed, fertilizer, and land preparation. A planted crop would have additional expenses of planting and possibly of applying chemicals. The harvested crop would have the greatest expense, as it would also include the cost of harvest. And that ends part 2. To recap, in paragraph 50, we learned about the various coverage options, basic versus buy-up. Basic coverage offers a guarantee of 50% of expected production and 55% of the average market price. Buy-up coverage offers guarantees of 50, 55, 60, and 65% of production, with 100% of the average market price. Paragraph 51 tells us if a cause of loss is eligible or ineligible. Paragraph 52 lists eligible crops, and paragraph 53 covers the ineligible ones. In general, non-insurable crops commercially grown for food or fiber are typically eligible. Paragraph 54 explains the coverage period, when it starts and when it ends. As you've heard before, this is a pretty important paragraph, so you're probably going to refer to it pretty often. In paragraph 55, define payment rates and payment factors. In the next video, we're going to discuss producer eligibility.